balloons, bazookas, boobies, bosoms, boulders, cans, hooters, knockers, melons, honkers, jugs, rack, tatas, tits, torpedoes, guns, bust, doorknobs, coconuts, and our favorite one, the girls. Welcome to the All About Breastfeeding show, where your host, Lori, highlights mothers just like yourself and goes beyond the surface questions and digs deep so they share not only their joys and happiness in their daily breastfeeding life, but also their pain and struggles and how they worked through them.
Just Lori, preparing to return to work. I have a really special treat. I have decided to do a show where we will have part 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and it will be all about preparing to return to work for the breastfeeding mom who's pumping. Part 1, which is today, is all about the calendar says it's time to get busy. What do you need to know? How to get started pumping and storing your milk. Then part 2 in a week is going to be released, tips and tricks to make pumping as easy and convenient as possible. Then a week after that, part 3, babies and bottles and daycare, what you need to know for a smooth transition. Part 4, tips and tricks to help you navigate pumping in the workplace. And the last one, part 5, troubleshooting. This is going to be a great show, and I'd love to have listeners' participation. What all you need to do is send questions to allaboutbreastfeeding.biz/contact, and I will read them on the air and answer your questions. It just depends on what questions come in. Let's say I don't get any questions. I still will read my most frequently asked questions. And let's say we get a ton of questions. Well, I might even make a whole show about it. But for this 5-part series, what I really wanted to do was break it down into chunks so you can feel very comfortable by the time you have to return to work. You will know how to start pumping, how to store. You'll have information on tips and tricks to make pumping easy and convenient. I'm going to give you some information and checklists on babies and bottles and daycare. Also, lots of tips on how you navigate pumping in the workplace. You're just going through a whole transition now, going back to work. And there's a lot of little things to figure out in this area. And there's certainly enough information that it took, again, a lot more than I would feel comfortable putting in one show. That's where this Part 5 series came about. So I hope you enjoy today's show. Let's get started. Welcome to All About Breastfeeding, the place where the girls hang out. Episode number 62, Just Lori. Preparing to return to work. If you are like most new mothers, the transition from work to full-time new motherhood was pretty intense. It feels like just yesterday that you gave birth and your whole world was turned upside down and inside out. You've gone through this rite of passage that had this huge learning curve, and the subject was new motherhood and breastfeeding. Now that you feel like you finally have your bearings, you take a look at the calendar and realize that it's now getting close to your returning to work. Well, not exactly next week, but close enough that you're starting to think about pumping and storing your milk. Yes, another transition is going to be coming down the pike for you. And you're trying to figure it out, how you can possibly begin to store milk for you for when you go back to work. When you have a baby that's breastfeeding frequently throughout the day, your head is spinning while you try and figure out how to satisfy your baby and pump extra to freeze. You're also getting way ahead of yourself and thinking about pumping at work, where to pump, how do moms do this discreetly. Well, you are in the right place, and I'm so glad you are here at the All About Breastfeeding show. This is a topic that is so important to mothers that I really want to do it justice. This is a very common fork in the road for breastfeeding mothers who return to work. A lack of information and support is a very common reason for moms to stop breastfeeding once they return to work. I don't want this to happen to you. If you're determined, then I'm determined to give you all the information you need to know to make this as smooth a transition as possible. I don't want to give you just a few pointers, pat you on your back, and then send you on your way. I want to give you as much need to know and nice to know information. To do this topic justice, I know it would be way too long to bring it to you in just one episode, so I've done the next best thing. I have broken it down into short, doable chunks. This way, you cannot be overwhelmed with the information. I want to do the best job possible in helping you prepare for this next transition in your mothering life. If you're listening to this show while doing something else, don't freak out. Each show will be accompanied with cheat sheets and handy checklists for you to download. I will have a wrap-up at the end of each show, as well as handy checklists and charts for you to download. So you don't need to take notes if you can't. All you need to do is remember to go to allaboutbreastfeeding.biz/podcasts to find the episode you're looking for. There you will find show notes that will point you in the direction to download your checklists and free handouts. So here's a breakdown of this 5-part series. Part 1, which is today. The calendar says it's time to get busy. What you need to know to get started pumping and storing your milk. Part 2. Tips and tricks to make pumping as easy and convenient as possible. Part 3. Babies and bottles and daycare. What you need to know for a smooth transition. Part 4. Tips and tricks to help you navigate pumping in the workplace. Part 5. Troubleshooting. This is going to be a great show with listeners' participation. You can start sending in your questions now. allaboutbreastfeeding.biz/contact, and I will read them on the air and answer your questions. You can also send it to aabreastfeeding@hotmail.com, and I will get your questions there too. Okay, so let's get going. To start off with, staying home as long as possible will work in your favor. You quickly learn that as a mother, your new role often means thinking outside the box and being creative, and planning your return to work is no different. Perhaps it's possible to stay home a little longer than you had initially planned. This will give you more time to get used to breastfeeding, to get really good at it, to build a good supply, and for you to recover from pregnancy and birth. Sometimes we need to do some adjusting. Speak to our employers. If self-employed, ask for some help. I have found that the reality is for some moms is that their positions actually will allow them to return to work, maybe part-time, and gradually build themselves up to full-time. This gives them a bit of a breather. Perhaps you can start back to work on a Wednesday, so you don't jump into a full-packed week. Perhaps start back to work half days, maybe going into work every other day. I have known some pretty determined moms who have taken this discussion to their employers and found that they were actually much more amenable to being flexible than they ever would have thought. For some mothers, they just do not have the luxury and need to return to work even sooner than they had planned. As you will see, there are quite a few variables, so the advice given is going to be a loose template in which you are going to need to refine it and make it your own. Sirens going off. These are the things you want to pay close attention to that I will be bringing up during this series. I find that they are not usually discussed, but some really excellent tips to make your time spent here extremely worthwhile. So pay attention to when you hear the sirens going off. I'm going to give you a hint right now as to the two topics in this episode when you're going to hear the sirens going off. The first one, the last thing you want to do is become this super pumping mama, pumping many times a day to pack your freezer with milk. I am going to caution you against this, and I will tell you about it later in the show. The second one is to check for lipase before you freeze too many bags of milk. More on this later. First things first, what is your return to work day? Let's say it's July 25th, 2016. Now I want you to take a big X and put it on your calendar 3 weeks before your first day back at work. So this means you will be putting the X on July 4th. This is the day, the big X is when you want to start pumping. My plan is for you to spend 14 days pumping and 7 days orientating your baby to the bottle. If your baby has already begun taking the bottle, this will leave you more days to collect and store your milk. Since there are a lot of unknowns, we can only estimate. I like to overestimate, which will result in you having more milk stored than perhaps not enough milk stored. The first siren. I would also like for you to spend the last few weeks at home enjoying your baby and not turning into super pumping mama, which means if you can get away with pumping once a day and collect enough milk, that is optimal. If not, you may need to pump twice a day. I know of many moms who pump many times a day. They are using up valuable time that I would rather them spend it being with your baby, napping, going for impromptu walks with your baby, healing from birth, having lunch with friends, and dinner with family, or just enjoy being home. When you're spending your maternity leave so distracted with multiple pumping sessions per day, it's just awful. And then when you get back to work, you're exhausted and you hate pumping. The other problem is that your body has now become used to all that frequency of the milk removal, and now when you return to work, you're probably not going to be able to keep up the same breastfeeding, pumping, feeding, pumping, feeding, pumping, feeding, pumping routine. So, in other words, when you were feeding and pumping, feeding and pumping, feeding and pumping at home, you may have had like 8 or 10 milk removals in the time period that when you're back to work, you'll be lucky if you get to pump 3 times in the same amount of time you pumped at home. And the result? Your breasts will give you an argument. They will be aching when you return to work, possibly become engorged, and put you at risk for clogged milk ducts. I have helped many a mom who found herself in this position, and I'd love to avoid you getting there. And how did she get there? She just didn't know that the excessive pumping while home might cause these problems when she came back to work. So how much milk do you need to collect and store? Well, again, everyone will be different, meaning how much milk will your baby take each feeding? How many bottles will your baby need to have while away from you? Again, since this is unknown, we can only guess. You can begin to take note at how many breastfeedings your baby averages during the same time period when you would be away at work. Whatever that number is, I would add in 1 more feeding. Remember, we like to overestimate to ensure plenty of milk while you're gone. On average, your baby will take between 3 and 4 ounces for each bottle feeding. Now we're going to overthink and say 5 ounces. On average, you'll be gone for 3 feedings if you work an average Monday through Friday 9 to 5 job, figuring in 1 hour of travel each way. We can say that you'll be gone from your baby for about 10 hours. In that 10-hour time period, your baby will likely take 3 bottles and perhaps 4. So again, we're going to overthink and say 5 bottles. So the math continues. You will need 5 bottles per day and 5 ounces of milk in each bottle. This equals 25 ounces. Now remember, It may turn out that your baby only needs 3 bottles with 3 ounces in each, and this would be 9 ounces you would need to have for your first day back at work. Maybe 4 bottles with 4 ounces, and this would be 16 ounces. Are you beginning to see why it's hard to know, and that's why I'm giving you a loose template? But overestimating takes the anxiety and stress out of not having enough when you go back to work. This will usually also enable you to put aside some milk for the second day at work. It's nice to have extra for those times when you might be running late or your baby was hungrier than usual. The worst that happens is that you have a nice little stash in the freezer when you return to work, and that's not so bad, right? But there's a difference between a little overestimating and what I talked before about becoming this super pumping mama. Once you return to work and give it a few weeks, you may see a few patterns emerge with regards to the amount of bottles and the volume your baby takes. This will make it easier for you to figure out how much you need and in what increments to store it in. Okay, so now that we have that part figured out, we can say the goal is to have 25 ounces stored, the higher end of our estimation. This is how this math works out. If you pump once a day for 14 days and you collect 1 ounce each time, this will give you 14 ounces. If you realize you're only able to collect 1 ounce per pumping session, you now realize you will need to pump twice a day. So now if you pump twice a day and each day you get 2 ounces, in 14 days you will have 28 ounces. Now you have your 25 ounces that we're looking for. Are you starting to see how this whole thing works? Now the next question you might ask is, well, when do I pump if I'm always breastfeeding and the feeding times are unpredictable? Aha! Glad to answer this question. You will find out how your body works. However, most mothers will say they have more milk left over after an early morning breastfeeding than they will have later on in the day. So, going along with this, you always want to feed your baby first, and then shortly after that morning breastfeeding, hopefully within a half hour, you'll get on the pump and pump both sides for about 15 to 20 minutes. Now remember, your baby just had a good feeding, so if you don't get much milk, but your baby was well fed, do not panic. Your basic requirement is to make enough milk for your baby, and you're already doing that. The rest is leftover. So don't start thinking you don't have enough. You might be frustrated if the volume is lower than you like, and so you might get it into your head, well, what if I wait a little longer and then I'll have more milk collected? While this is true, the reason I don't suggest doing this, at least when you're first starting, is because you may wind up pumping too close to the next breastfeeding, and then your baby will be fussy because there was not enough milk for him or her. Remember what I said earlier about how much you need to collect? Figure out what you think you need to collect, and then based on the average volume collected, decide, do you need to pump once a day or twice a day? Remember I talked about this being a loose template which you will individualize to meet your needs. Well, what if you need to return in 1 week and have not begun pumping yet? Depending upon how much milk you need, you might need to pump more than once or twice a day. Because of the additional workload and what it means when you return to work, I hope you don't need to do that, but as moms, you just do what you need to do. Now, also, do not panic when you see a low volume and start thinking, how are you possibly going to get enough milk when you return to work if you're only pumping 1 to 2 ounces each pumping session? Here's how this will work. The milk you have stored will go to your baby on Monday. Now this is the milk it took you a few weeks to collect. But now on Monday, your baby is not going to be actively breastfeeding. So when you go to pump both sides at the same time for 15 minutes, you will get a full feeding's worth and then some. As long as you pump as often as your baby is getting bottles, you should be able to keep up a good supply. But back to that later. I hope this helps relieve any anxiety you might be feeling. Yep, that's the second siren. After you pump and refrigerate a few bags of milk and freeze a few bags of milk, I recommend defrosting a bag or two and taking the refrigerated one and putting them both on the counter. I want you to smell the fresh milk and smell the defrosted milk, and I recommend tasting both. Actually, just to backtrack just a little bit, it would be helpful if at some point you tasted your freshly pumped milk a couple of days ago when you pumped it, so you know what the milk usually tastes like before you get to this little experiment. Some moms realize that their milk, refrigerated or defrosted, has an odd smell or tastes kind of soapy. Here's what's happening. Lipase is an amazing enzyme that's in your milk. It's normally present in human milk, and some moms just have an excess of lipase in their milk. This normal enzyme begins to break down the milk fat soon after the milk is expressed, and this definitely is not harmful to your baby. It just seems that some babies mind the flavor difference and others are okay with it. If you notice this smell, I would recommend two things. The first recommendation would be to offer it to your baby and see if he or she seems to mind the taste. If your baby has not taken a bottle and you put this milk in a bottle, you might think the baby's rejecting the milk when perhaps they are just not used to the bottle. So this would not be the best way to test your baby's interest. The second recommendation would be to treat your milk as if your baby did mind it. The reason the siren went off is because imagine if you have several weeks of pumped milk and you only realize after you've frozen 25 ounces that your baby will not drink it. This would be a real downer, which is why it's helpful to try the milk for your baby before you've frozen too many ounces. And the answer would be to get rid of that soapy taste is you can begin to get into the habit of scalding your freshly pumped milk. I will have a handout that goes into detail on lipase, what it is, how it affects your pumped milk, and how to deal with it. And you will find this by going to allaboutbreastfeeding.biz/freebies. I don't want you to get incredibly distracted. It actually doesn't happen that often, but the reason I'm bringing it up is because lots of times it's not brought up. And if this happens to you and you've banged away a whole bunch of milk, it's going to be, like I said, a real downer. There still are things that you can do to get around it, but it's certainly nice to know ahead of time. On to the next thing. Should I fill up the 8-ounce bags and then freeze? My answer, at least in the beginning, is definitely not. Here is how it will work. As you pump and collect the milk, I would suggest to collect and store it in 1-ounce and 3-ounce increments. If you fill up a 6-ounce or 8-ounce bag and it gets defrosted and your baby does not drink it all, you're apt to waste some of your milk. Remember, once you're at work for a few weeks, you may see a pattern emerge, and then you can begin to store in 4-ounce increments if that's typically what you find your baby drinks. The easiest way to store your milk is to use breast milk storage bags, and you may find other ways of storing your milk. I'm just giving you a starter way. Once you have put the appropriate amount of milk in the bag and closed it properly and marked it with how many ounces and the date, lay it flat in the freezer. This will take up a lot less freezer space. You will want to mark how many ounces because once flat and frozen, you'll not be able to tell exactly how many ounces are in the bag. Okay, so now you have reached your goal. You have enough milk frozen. If your baby is used to taking the bottle, then you can use that last week to pump and store even more milk. It's always nice to have a stash. If your baby has never taken the bottle, this gives you 7 days to help your baby learn how to use the bottle and be comfortable doing so. I will be doing another show on bottle feeding. However, for right now, let's assume you have enough milk and your baby is taking the bottle well. Hooray for you, for all your hard work. You are now ready to return to work, and you don't need to worry about having enough milk for your baby. This is a huge goal you have just accomplished. You have now joined the ranks of pumping moms. This is episode number 62, and episode number 64, part 2, will be about tips and tricks of the trade about pumping and how to make it more convenient. By the time you finish listening to part 5, you will be an expert in the pumping your milk for work department. Please remember to check out the show notes for this episode, which will lead you to 2 downloadable forms I know you will find helpful. So today we talked about the big take-home messages, I think, are to give you plenty of time if possible to start storing your milk, to read the information on lipase and how it might affect your milk so you can plan for this and act accordingly. The other take-home message is not to be the super pumping mama and overdo the pumping and storing before you go back to work. It causes some big problems. And the other take-home message is to make sure you don't store your milk and freeze it in very large increments, because if your baby does not drink all the milk for that feeding, you're liable to waste the milk. Since today's show is all about transitions, I will leave you with this quote by Mandy Hale. When you are transitioning to a new season of life, the people and situations that no longer fit you will fall away. Until the next show, bye-bye. Well, there's the end of today's show. I hope you found it very interesting, and feel free to share with any of your friends who could use this detailed information about getting ready to pump and go back to work. I will see you on the next show.